The remarks that I wanted to open with are probably an attempt in my own way, my elliptical way, to try and tell you why I am so fond of this school, why I love this school, and why I love the people who walk the halls here, and the ideas that issue from lecterns here, that are stacked in your books here, that advice that is passed quietly at desk crits here, and even the work that has been posted by students on the walls in the room next door last week and this week, or next week and this week, I guess. The work which reminds all of us who are ever on juries here why we practice in the first place. And so I hope I can convey some sense of my gratitude to the school overall. I know that we all come here by slightly different paths, and I know that you had to open the door a little bit wider to welcome me, as you have in the past. What, Michael, this is going on for some months now, to welcome me as you have. I'm grateful beyond description for the Driehaus Prize, but I'm also grateful for the support that this institution has afforded people like myself and so many others that might not have found that support any other place. So I hope all of that is evident. When we dated, my wife and I, when we dated, my wife lived on Capitol Hill, and she worked for the U.S. Senate that had people like Sam Nunn and Bill Bradley and Patrick Moynihan and Baker from Tennessee. Remarkable group of people that she worked for. She worked on Capitol Hill, which is a beautiful neighborhood in Washington, D.C. I lived in Adams Morgan, which was an interesting neighborhood in itself. It was full, even then, of strivers and immigrants. And I worked for a couple of remarkable small firms. And the two firms that I worked for were pretty typical of a cohort of a bigger group of firms that I would describe as kind of on the higher rungs of erudition and maybe the lower rungs of experience and seniority. And it's a unique situation, so what happens is there's abundance of talent and ambition and energy and ideas, and there's not always enough professional challenges to meet them. And so in these situations, you have to have some kind of accommodation if you're going to avoid a certain type of frustration. If I had moved to New York, I think that this accommodation might have taken the form of doing interiors that were incredibly rich in materials and in details, interiors that were stuffed with as many different ideas as a first novel. And in Washington, D.C., they took the form of these almost near-perfect buildings in the backyards, the wooded backyards of Colonial Center Hall Colonials in Northwest D.C. And we did renovations and small houses and additions, and it was evident that they exuded authority and thoughtfulness, and we enthused about how you got 3 tones of light that would hit a certain type of lap siding. We could case an opening a dozen different ways. We could make a post meet a lintel 100 different ways. Practice generally was great, people were great, and it was a lot of fun. On weekends, Zoanne and I would often go out in the country, and we would leave our beautiful neighborhoods, and we would go out towards Loudoun County, which you may or may not know is north and west of Washington, D.C. It is an unparalleled rural environment and is interrupted only occasionally by a little German town of surpassing beauty. And we would go out River Road on the Potomac, Maryland side. We would go out past the sod farms. The road would turn to gravel. We would arrive upon the White's Ferry, and we would cross the Potomac River at White's Ferry, cross over on the Jubal Early cable ferry, and then we would go down to Waterford, where the woods gave way to sort of arable fields, incredibly beautiful part of Virginia. And the reason we took this particular route was because between Washington and Leesburg on the Virginia side, the countryside was just irreversibly diminished by the most depressing real estate development. And the forces, the impersonal and large forces that were propelling this development and were threatening what still remained of Loudoun County at that time, had this unexpected effect of making the work that I was doing in the backyards of DC seem somewhat less consequential. And I think that everybody at some point sort of asks themselves, what does the world demand of them at that time? And I would say that 3 years out of school, the world seemed to demand of me that I flee the backyards. And that this was also a flight, I knew, from great craftsmanship, from really enviable budgets, from gratifying refinement, from really nice, smart clients and colleagues and bosses. This was all unavoidably part of the bargain. So my wife quit her job. I quit my job. We moved and got married and went to what we thought was the edge of the world in Florida. And we worked in the slipstream of DPZ, who I think was notable at that time for being the only firm that was really interested in those forces that had ruined the Virginia countryside on the way out to Loudoun County, and that were threatening a part of the state and a part of the country that Zoanne and I both really love. So let's say that you're an architect in Florida, a young architect in Florida, and you're trying to figure out what modern architecture should look like and what modern towns should look like and modern cities. I have to recall the dilemma. You probably will face it in a few years, but the magazines are going to compete to flatter you, and you're going to have ready-made teams that are going to have talking points, and they're going to compete for your loyalties. The real question that you guys have to ask yourself is, how are you going to think about these questions for yourself? And the obstacles that are really in the way is that we all sort of have these widely varying ideas of what the world is like and how the world works. And we also tend to look at things and edit and filter them very differently. And even if you're able to look at the evidence objectively, the experts disagree to such an incredibly dismaying extent that it really puts you in a quandary. You don't really know what to think of it. It's unsettling. So living in Florida sort of compounds all these other problems. A few years ago, we were working on a project up in a remote stretch of the Florida Panhandle, which, as I speak it sounds a little bit redundant. But we were part of a much bigger team from all over the country. And this particular client owned land that was equal in land mass to the state of Rhode Island. And they moved a federal highway so that they can increase the amount of beachfront land that they had, if you can imagine that. And they carved a main street out of the pitch pines of Northwest Florida. Now it so happens that on this same site in the 1830s, there was a city of 6,000 people on this very same site, a brackish bay. The rise of this particular city, 6,000 people in Florida at that time was a lot of people. The rise of the city was fueled by the cotton trade that came down the Apalachicola River, by cheap bank paper, and by land speculation. The founder's intent was explicitly to drive out of business the company town just downriver called Apalachicola. They wanted to drive it out of existence. In 1838, it hosted the Territorial Convention, and it looked like it was going to become the first state capital of Florida. It's 1838. In 1843, it had been wiped from the face of the earth by yellow fever, a hurricane, and a fire. So I was telling a colleague who was involved in the project about the history of the site, and with, for him, characteristic worldliness and goodwill, he said, well, you know, life is tragic, but sometimes we get to do some good. The clients for this project were very decent, and they were very smart and very capable people. And their company was named for the very town that had been wiped off the face of the earth. The founder of the company had dreamed at one time of building an ideal southern city on this site in the 1930s. Unfortunately, it wasn't realized before he died, and his successor in the company sort of disavowed land development for just cutting trees for pulp. I don't know if any of you have ever read Dave Eggers' book called Hologram for the King. One of the things that's interesting to an architect is that the new unrealized royal cities in Saudi Arabia play this unlikely role throughout the book. And throughout, you're kind of suspended between thinking that the projects that are being described have ambitions that were hopeful and inspiring. And on the On the other hand, you're sort of thinking, well, maybe they're con jobs, and maybe they're diversions, and maybe they're bread and circuses for restive populations. And I have to tell you, as a Floridian, I know this feeling incredibly well. I think it's probably the central mystery of Florida, of George Merrick, or Henry Flagler, or Henry Diston, or Carl Fisher, or Alfred DuPont. And I think that it might actually be one of the central mysteries of life as well. So were these guys visionaries? Were they con artists? And if they were con artists, were they conning other people, or were they conning themselves? Did they fall prey to a disastrously glamorous imagination? Part of the fun for me of reading Dave Eger's book is not deciding finally whether they were visionaries or fools. The project that we were working on was part of the company's belated entry into real estate development. And it was laid low by the Great Recession. I refer to the one of my generation. Fairly or not, some of the investors in the company decided that the hubris of the project was cause to have them short the company's stock. And so the wisdom of the fickle market rendered the verdict of foolish after, of course, it had rendered the version of visionary. Now, as this drama played out prominently, tar balls from the Deepwater Horizon also washed ashore, which was just more or less a gratuitous slap in the face, and it created just more acrimony and a terrible situation. It turns out that the French, after all, had it right, because in 1717, the French had founded a short-lived outpost on the very same site before this territorial boomtown that they called Crevecoeur, or Broken Heart. Progress in Florida, I know this is circuitous, but I'll eventually get to the point here. Progress in Florida is really undeniable, but it's not inevitable, right? And it requires less vision than it requires constant effort and wakefulness. Progress lurches erratically, and it's even subject to retrenchment. Goodwill abounds. It's often thwarted by folly, greed, ballyhoo, and self-importance. And goodness knows nature, for its part, gives and it takes with astonishing indifference. So when Walker Percy is a Southern writer, wrote a book called The Moviegoer. When he received the National Book Award, someone asked him why the South had produced so many fine writers, and he said, in his own sort of enigmatic way, that it was because the South had lost the war. Another Southern writer named Flannery O'Connor, who wished to be helpful in explaining what Walker Percy meant by this, said, well, it's because we've had our falls, she said, because we were born with an inborn sense of human limitations and with a sense of mystery that we would not have had in our first state of innocence. Now, this is something that I'd like to return to at the end and conclusion of my remarks, because I think that this offers incredibly great hope in circumstances that are often very discouraging. But first, more discouraging things. So we're capable of incredibly entertaining enormously contradictory things in Florida. We're amused today when we think about building islands in the Arabian Gulf that look like continents or palm fronds or something. And at the same time, you know, we're perfectly capable of living on sandbars that migrate that no one would have lived in 100 years ago. We see no apparent contradiction in that. Indiana gave Florida Carl Fisher, right? Do you guys know Carl Fisher? He made Miami Beach by dredging Biscayne Bay on the backside of this soggy spit of mangrove and throwing the sand up, and created Miami Beach out of it. He did quite well by it. And he made a fortune making Miami Beach, but he died in penury while the gangsters ran his fiefdom of, you know, anti-boosterism. We elect mosquito commissioners, and we drain the land, and we flood the land, and we bomb it from airplanes. We try almost anything to rid ourselves of mosquitoes, but there are probably 500,000 mosquitoes for each person who lives there. So on our part of the coast, we can see rockets up at Cape Canaveral. We go down to the beach to watch them go up in the air. They drop their booster rockets, they roll a little bit, and then they lean into the thin upper atmosphere, and we're thrilled. At the same time, right off our shore, we're still bringing up silver from a fleet of 40 Spanish ships that were destroyed in 1715 as they were returning to Spain with a fortune. And then, even today, we still have Caribbean refugees that drift up onto our shores, and the precarious rafts that they build are no less impressive than the rockets that thrill us so much as that we heave into space. The remarkably clear limestone aquifers in North Florida are now clouded like cataracts from runoff from farms. You probably read about this, but the full moon high tides are pushing up through the storm sewer lids in Miami Beach. We have historically tried to drain the interior of Florida for the rich loam that every northerner, one after another, just sort of dreamed of cultivating. And what we really found out is we didn't know what we were dealing with. And so now we're trying to flood it again. But we're a tax haven state, and the only tax we really believe in is a room tax on northerners. So come for spring break. But it may be that we're not able to match the federal money that was pledged for the restoration of the channelized Kissimmee River or the dammed and the diverted Everglades. Let me get a drink if you don't mind. So we also carve golf courses, heavily watered and fertilized, out of live oak hammocks. But water moccasins and alligators are lining the edges of the putting greens and the fairways, more or less waiting to patiently reclaim what they probably have in the long run anyway. And we have cleared the pine palmetto habitat of the eastern diamondback rattlesnake so that we can build dispiriting subdivisions with aspirational names. Burmese python. So this is the snake paragraph, if you haven't gotten that idea. And no one in Vero Beach is going to be surprised by this, but Burmese pythons, we don't know how they got here, but the theory is, it's promulgated by the New Yorker, that they were in pet warehouses at the time of Hurricane Andrea. And somehow they went into the air in great numbers and they landed in the Everglades. Okay? And now they've already muscled out the native species, regardless of how they got there, what the theory is. They muscled out the native species, and that the only wager now is how far north their natural habitat is going to extend. Large monitor lizards are wandering around those subdivisions outside Fort Myers that were emptied. By the recent recession, and they're occasionally eating stray household pets. So, what we we are what we call euphemistically a right-to-work state. And what this really means is that craft is very rare. It means that block is laid like rubble. It means that wood is joined with what I can only describe as approximation. If you've been to the Panhandle of Florida, you have some inkling of this. We dream about more benign clients like maybe LA, where water doesn't actually start to dissolve buildings the moment we take occupancy of them. Wood rots and rebar rusts and concrete spalls, and then you have attorneys who are trolling homeowners associations and condominiums for plaintiffs. Sometimes we build with incredibly miserly efficiency, erecting enormous buildings so that those poor souls who are working in the middle of them are working in perpetual twilight. On the other hand, we're also capable of spending money foolishly and to very little effect. And it's really amazing that on some buildings with even the meanest and the most meager budgets, we provide these sort of nervous ups and downs and ins and outs with seemingly no more intent or purpose than to just keep boredom at arm's length. And while we see to the scrum of the speculative market the unglamorous buildings that greet us at the edges of even the most beautiful Florida towns, we retreat to design a few low-impact buildings that are hard to find. So we admire the parking garage in Miami Beach, of course, but it's impossibly expensive and it has nothing transferable to our own modest hometowns. We lavish praise on those aesthetic efforts that we read about in the magazines where 10 layers of filter 10 layers of a museum ceiling filter light exquisitely. But at the same time, we can't be bothered with trying to convince a developer to forego just even a modicum of daylight, a modicum of profit so that you can get a little bit of daylight into a double-loaded residential corridor. Specialists generally usurp generalists. There's all kinds of people with narrow expertise that approach building with a single-mindedness that in isolation is a little irrational, more than a little self-interested and unavoidably distorted in some way. If a building in Florida is grotesque, it's usually because it gives too much weight to strictly narrow considerations. Those of, say, the real estate agent or the civic booster or the marketers, the structural engineer, the prefab enthusiast, the lead consultant, the theorist who wants to raise our consciousness, and the architect with our ever-lurching formal preoccupations. And for a state waiting for 10 million more inhabitants, we waste a lot of land. We have a large shopping strip in our town, referred to, and I swear this is without irony, as Miracle Mile. No one lives there, no one meets friends there, no one worships there, no one goes to a civic or cultural institution there. There are no squares, there's no human scale, and there's no beauty. And there certainly are no miracles that occur there. There's only this wide eponymous street of which we must seem inordinately proud. We're not talking about a city that is a stressed and atrophying city. This is a prosperous city. And Miracle Mile sits underused in the middle of a prosperous small city that's growing and sending tendrils of infrastructure and utilities out into the grapefruit groves that until very recently crowded the edge of the city and lofted the sweet smell of blossoms over the city each spring. So, to return to this question, how do you figure out what modern architecture and modern buildings and modern towns might look like? If we are confused on this matter, I would suggest that we come by that confusion honestly. And I've come to some very tentative conclusions, which of course are subject to recalibration if the evidence should change. My favorite description of architecture, and you'll have to forgive me because I know I use this too much, is Flannery O'Connor's description of writing. She said, "It's about everything human, and we are made of dust, and if you scorn getting dusty, then you shouldn't try to write fiction. It's simply not a grand enough job for you." End quote. The world's not made up of good guys and bad guys. We're all complicated contraptions, divided against ourselves, and each of us are coarse, noble, and foolish all at once. Building anything requires a lot of people. So first of all, you have to make your peace with our natures, and you have to even appreciate and maybe even learn to love the spectacle that ensues. Buildings, in my experience, get built or don't get built, or they get built well or they get built badly because of stubbornness, ambition, lack of ambition, fatigue, laziness, hope, curiosity, lack of curiosity, courage, cravenness, generosity, largeness of heart, everything human. Building at any scale in Florida is a spectacularly flawed human process, and these flaws are not peripheral annoyances. They're central and unavoidable. Building reproaches us for our occasional detached high-mindedness, and it demands instead a more measured and circumspect sense of our place in the bigger scheme of things. Second, I observe that conditions in Florida improve steadily, if erratically, and not without considerable and sustained effort. And while I'm amused and even charmed by Florida's swagger and its outside ambitions, like Flannery O'Connor, I'm almost always as impressed or more impressed by the limits of what we know than than by the extent of what we know. Consequently, we have our convictions, but we don't accuse those who disagree with us of bad faith. We incline towards optimism, but never towards triumphalism. We take pride in our work, but we don't preen. And we look for eagerness for better materials and ways of building, but we also have a really clear idea about the terrible burdens of failure that are borne by others and not by us. And so we do not talk in terms of risk-taking because we're spending other people's money and we are in entrusted with other people's hopes and aspirations. Third, history keeps us from overweighting the present just because we happen to be a part of it. You try to improve things every day of your life, but it's probably best not to talk excessively about transformations and new paradigms and new world orders and the end of history. That was understandable to me for about 10 years in the 1990s, but it's the talk of sleepwalkers now. Theory's not much in help in trying to understand Florida. Florida is just singularly unsentimental, and it's accepting of carefully calibrated flights of fancy, but is completely disabused of untoward innocence. We are entitled to our abstractions, provided we can also readily summon the concrete, and we're entitled to our generalizations, provided we can also summon the example of individuals who invariably prove those generalizations to be incorrect. Fourth, hype is corrosive to the trust that has to be established between architects and the public. And so you try to avoid several common forms of hype. You don't use traditional or classical forms to lend gravity to things that inherently lack gravity. You don't use extreme formal invention to disguise the unremarkable, because the unremarkable can be attractive, but it can't be remarkable. You don't try to disguise the degree to which we deal with the same problems as our forebears. No irretrievable main streets, but no Tomorrowlands either. They siphon talent that we need for now. Fifth, cities and towns on one hand, and agricultural and natural landscapes on the other are two sides of the same coin. When you cross the high bridge in our town that connects the barrier island to the mainland, you can look north for about 10 miles along the Indian River Archipelago, and you have that feeling that is described by astronauts when they see things from space. And from up on top of this bridge, you're impressed not by how resilient the Indian River is, but how fragile it is and how, to the extent to which it is our responsibility. Now, in the other direction, when you cross the same bridge, you can see Miracle Mile, which I described earlier. And you know that 10 million people are coming to Florida over the next few decades, whether we're prepared for them or not. And you know that a lot of difficult political decisions are going to have to be made about where they go. So, if you can provide disarming and even occasionally inspiring forms of urbanism for the thousands of underused places like Miracle Mile, you may be able to spare some citrus groves or the brackish estuary of the Indian River or the freshwater lakes of Central Florida. Sixth, while we can inveigh against it, we can't wish away the chaff and the dross of modern buildings. We can only cede it to others to take care of. So we will work on all the dispiriting building types to create the first impressions of a town. And I include big boxes and the mini storage and the parking garages and the central plants and our own bottom feeders, the condominium. We try to make beautiful parking lots, and we'll use stormwater storage to better effect. When the market demands low construction costs, we will work with cheaper systems. We design to the capabilities of the trades, and we also have the good grace not to blame them for bad workmanship, which is ultimately not their fault. Finally, there are no cities without those who are less fortunate. It's never enough, but you do what you can to bring along with you as many people as possible, and you grade your peers who try to do this on a more forgiving curve, because their work in formal terms will not be conventionally satisfying. It's fine to try and raise the consciousness of a few, but we try first to provide for the material needs of many. It's natural to admire masterpieces, but it's also important to provide incrementally better models for recurring problems. And it's fine to tout the freedom and the autonomy in which my professional cohort is probably a little bit overinvested, provided that we understand that this is a luxury afforded only those of us who are most fortunate, and provided we understand the responsibilities that come with being so fortunate. In wrapping up these comments, I'd just like to return to what Flannery O'Connor said, attributed to Walker Percy, and here I'll put my own spin on it, that our capacity for greatness as fathers or sons or mothers and daughters and as employers or friends or neighbors, as writers or politicians, teachers, doctors, soldiers, or architects, will probably come less from our triumphs than from experiencing just those limitations that so frustrate and humiliate us. From storms that chase us from our homes, from speculative bubbles that drain our savings and gray our hair, from arable land that has been paved over, from cities in peril and cities that we have already lost, from battles that we have lost and from battles that we have won at too high a price, that something redeeming might be made from some pretty unpromising material that will assume some unlikely forms, that we will build it with a lot of people that we never suspected had the spark of nobility in them. But of course, all of this makes Florida just like anywhere else.